Hello all. In this video, I'm going to discuss with you Voltaire's Candide. However, this video will only be dedicated to discussing the context of the tale. However, a discussion of the text itself will follow in another video. So as we said in the introduction to the course, that in some of the texts we tackled, for example, Othello and the Duchess of Malfi, the focus was more on the text than on the context. However, in Candide, we have to focus on the context as well as the text to be able to understand the ideas embedded within the tale written by Voltaire. To start, let me introduce Voltaire to you. Voltaire is one of the most famous French writers. He was born into a wealthy family in 1694, educated by the Jesus Society at the College Louis le Grand. He became a reluctant law student to please his father, and he was briefly a diplomat. There is a very important information you need to know about Voltaire is that Voltaire was an atheist writer. He didn't believe in the existence of God, and that is why most of the tale we will be discussing together is a criticism of the philosophy of optimism, which was one of the most famous religious philosophies during the 18th century. From 1715, he occupied himself exclusively with his writing, earning his first brief spell of imprisonment in 1717-1718, wherein he was imprisoned in the Bastille. He was released, and then by 1726 he was in trouble again, had to flee to England, where he met King George I and many members of the literary and scientific elite. For much of the 1730s, he was in official disfavor and he was living in exile. By the 1740s, his fortunes recovered and he became a major figure on the European stage. By 1754, he quarreled with Frederick and he was refused entry back to France, and he was forced to wander around Central Europe. He settled in Switzerland. In 1756, he published the first edition of his essay on general history and on the manners and spirit of the nations. In 1757, he was involved in secret peace negotiations between Frederick of Prussia and Louis XV. So you notice that most of his life, Voltaire was very much intrigued by the political arena. In early 1759, Candide was published, and I will be talking about the publication history of Candide later. Voltaire stayed in the relative safety of Switzerland for most of the rest of his life, producing literary works well into his 80s. In 1762-63, he challenged the French government for the second time over the French Protestant merchant who was falsely accused of murdering his son for wanting to convert to Catholicism. In 1778, he returned to Paris for the first time in 20 years. But while he was there, he fell ill, and he died with the words, "For God's sake, leave me in peace." From his biography, we notice that Voltaire was very much interested in the politics of the day, and he was a person who opposed the corruption of the society, as well as having unique ideas with reference to religion and to the church. The publication history of Candide, well, actually, it first appeared in late January 1759 when it was issued in 3 simultaneous editions of 1,000 copies each in Paris, in Geneva, and in Amsterdam. And he did this because he was really scared that it would be censored. So he wanted to sell as many copies as possible before it was impounded. And he gets right, because in February 1759, just a month later, as you notice here, authorities in Paris and Geneva seized copies of Candide in an attempt to suppress it. The title page bore the inscription from the German of Dr. Ralph, and Voltaire's name did not appear. He only publicly admitted to being the author in 1768. Now, of course, Voltaire was intelligent enough to figure out that if his name was put on the text from the beginning, it wouldn't have been bought, or even it wouldn't have been published in the first place. However, he decided to put the name Dr. Ralph as the original author of the text and that this text is already translated from German. We will be looking at the title in a moment. The title page, I mean. In this book, several kinds of travel are implicated, either directly or indirectly. Among them are the personal diaries or journals of Candide and Cunegonde, as well as the digressions from the main track taken by main figures such as Candide's servant Cacambo. If you have a look at the tale with you, you will find that the first pages have a map. And in this map, it really gives you an explanation of Candide's journey, all the places he went to. And you will be able to figure out that all the cities in the map are real cities with the exception of one city, which is the city of El Dorado. We will be discussing the El Dorado episode in the next video when we deal with the text. The first genre we can affiliate Candide to is the genre of travel writing. And of course, travel writing because we are dealing with the journeys of Candide and the journeys of Cunegonde as well. But of course, Candide is our main protagonist here. And travel writing was a very famous genre during the 18th century, and it is a genre that is primarily descriptive and narrative. It tells the story, whether the story is real or imagined, of a person or a group of persons voyaging from place to place. In practice, no such writing is ever neutral, since travelers inevitably compare the worlds they are traveling through to their own world. Sometimes this can lead travelers to make negative and even racist judgments. At other times, it can lead them to recognize flaws in their own society, and on yet other occasions, it can lead them to reflect upon the universality of the human conditions. During the 18th century, many books were written according to such a genre. For example, the very famous novel by Jonathan Swift called Gulliver's Travels, and it was even made into a movie by Jack Black. The other genre we could affiliate Candide to is the genre of dystopian literature. In order to understand the meaning of dystopian literature, we have to first define utopian literature. A utopia is a perfect place. It's heaven on earth. And of course, in our life, we couldn't really find any utopias. However, we could find lots of dystopias. And of course, since dystopia is the opposite of utopia, then dystopia is a horrible place. It's a place where nothing is good. Now, of course, what Candide represents is a dystopian world where everything is corrupted and everybody is oppressed. Of course, in comparison to the only utopian place we will find in the tale, which was represented in El Dorado, which is in itself a completely imagined place. Is Candide a novel? Or is it a tale or a parable? Well, to start with, during the long 18th century, it was the first great period in the evolution of the novel. In France, the form was known as the roman because of its roots in medieval romance, and in English it was known as the novel. According to strict definitions of the 18th century novel, Candide does not entirely meet the generic requirements for the novel, or indeed for the novella, which is a short novel. So, what is the genre of Candide? If you start reading the tale itself, you will find that it begins with Once Upon a Time in Westphalia. Once Upon a Time is the apt introduction of a tale, basically. So in shape and in thrust, Candide is far closer to a fable or a parable, since its meanings lie comparatively close to the surface, and little happens within it that is not designed to make a point in the ongoing argument. The term used by the French to classify this kind of exercise was a philosophic tale. So we will deal with Candide as a philosophic tale. Candide is not only a philosophic tale, but a satirical philosophic tale as well. What is the meaning of satire? Well, actually, a satire is a writing that ridicules or mocks the failings of individuals, institutions, or societies. As Voltaire allows his readers to draw their own conclusions, Candide should probably be classified as indirect satire. Together with his contemporaries, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Johnson, and the poet Alexander Pope, Voltaire contributes in no small way to the long 18th century's reputation as Europe's greatest period of satire. This is the title page. Let's have a look at it. Well, it gives us the title, Candide or Optimism. This is the name of the tale. And then it says translated from the German of Dr. Ralph, with the additions found in the doctor's pocket when he died at Minden in the year of grace 1759. So to start with, why did Voltaire say that this is a translation from German? Of course, it is not a translation from German. It is originally written by Voltaire. But Voltaire did not write his name as its author until 1876 or something. Now, why? Well, first of all, the novel itself, or the tale itself, is a critical satire against the corruption of 18th century Europe. And that is why Voltaire produced three simultaneous editions in three different cities at the same time, because he knew that as soon as the governments in these cities would, have a glimpse at the tale here, they would very quickly impound its own sheets. So Voltaire wanted to explain that this is not me writing the tale, this is actually a translation from German. So if they decided to go and fetch this, German writer, he actually says here, well, if you're going to look at Dr. Ralph, where Dr. Ralph actually died in 1759, which is the date when the tale itself was published. The inventions of an original German text and a Dr. Ralph lent a quasi-objectivity to the text and distanced the narrator from Voltaire himself. Now, our narrator here is going to be Dr. Ralph, and he's going to give him certain characteristics in order to create the literary irony required by Voltaire. The idea of a German original and the existence of a Dr. Ralph are inventions, are part of the fiction itself. This playful element subverts the superficially earnest account of the young man, Candide's personal history, in the opening paragraph. Now, as I told you, the very first words of the tale, Once Upon a Time in Westphalia, suggest the beginning of a fairy tale and the combination of an absurd name, which is Monsieur the Baron von Thundertentron, who is supposedly, to be the uncle of Candide, of course, establishes immediately a very distinct narrative. What about our narrator? Well, our narrator, Dr. Ralph, is presented by Voltaire as being an extremely naive narrator. Well, actually, the gossip of the older servants in the source for the belief that Candide was the illegitimate son of the Baron's sister and a kindly and honest gentleman of the neighborhood, that the narrator describes Candide's presumed father so indulgently and not as an adulterer, suggests unworldly and naive qualities, qualities we soon discover also to be characteristic of Candide himself. From the outset, the reader is thus given very clear hints not to take at face value the narrator's version of events and his judgments of individuals, peoples, and places. Of course, this kind of a naive narrator creates the literary irony I referred to earlier. And by literary irony, I mean the use of a naive or a deluded hero or unreliable narrator whose view of the world differs widely from the true circumstances recognized by the author or by the readers. The account of Candide's travels and adventures by Voltaire's unreliable fictional narrator, Dr. Ralph, does indeed differ widely from the true circumstances recognized by the author or by the readers, and much of the humor in Candide is derived from the ironic distance between the narrator's words and Voltaire's satirical attack on his society. Now, this literary irony appears very clearly when you compare Cunegonde's story as narrated by Dr. Ralph at the beginning of the tale, and how Cunegonde herself narrates the story later on. Now, let me introduce to you the religious concept on which this tale is built on. And this is the religious concept of optimism. The use of optimism here is not its general usage. It's not optimism as opposite to pessimism, but optimism here is a religious concept, which means that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire's philosophical views expressed in Candide were defined in opposition to the belief in optimism which dominated the philosophy of his day. Now, of course, Voltaire, as an atheist writer, would never believe that he lives in the best of all possible worlds. However, many people during the 18th century believed in such a concept. Pangloss, who is Candide's tutor, is the spokesman on behalf of optimism. And of course, Voltaire describes Pangloss as an extremely comical character. Most of what he says is funny, is absurd. He represents optimism to a great extreme. The character of Pangloss was Voltaire's exaggerated comic creation, but optimism in the condition of the world and human prospects within it could be found pretty well everywhere in the Europe of the mid-18th century. For, of course, very clear reasons. The philosophy of optimism was more common among the rich than among the poor. Of course, if you are rich, you would believe this is the best of all possible worlds. Men than women, the healthy rather than the sick, slave owners rather than slaves. Now let's discuss the origins of optimism. They start with Anthony Ashley Cooper, who has speculated that benevolence was an instinct deeply embedded in human nature and quite consistent with self-interest. Since we all wished for one another's well-being, all that we needed to do was to follow our own inclinations and everything and everybody would be fine. The other character who believed a lot in optimism is the very famous 18th century poet Alexander Pope, whose poem Essay on Man is the supremely confident expression of this attitude, trumpeted forth as if from the console of some great organ. This is part of Alexander Pope's Essay on Man. He says, "All nature is but art unknown to thee, all chance direction which thou canst not see, all discord harmony not understood, all partial evil universal good, and spite of pride in erring reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right." Whatever is right is the motto of optimism. Whatever happens, whatever God wants, this is the right thing to happen, and you don't have the luxury of thinking about it. Now, of course, a person like Voltaire was totally opposing Alexander Pope to the extent that he made fun of whatever is right in a poem of his, and he was really satirizing this concept. The most important character in relation to the philosophy of optimism is the German Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz had argued the case from the nature of God. Since the Creator was both omniscient and omnipotent, and since he wished that his creatures should be happy, it followed of necessity that the world he had made was one that secured the most contentedness he could contrive. Leibniz did not deny that nasty things happened or that people suffered, but human beings were not omniscient, which means human beings have limited knowledge, and what appeared to them to be blemishes or setbacks could very well be part of the grand universal plan. Only God, with his serene overview, says how. The theory of optimism was the most frequently cited answers to two dilemmas theologians call the problem of evil and the problem of pain. Both pain and evil seem contradictory in a world supposedly overseen by a compassionate governor. In Candide, Voltaire repeatedly points this out. We should not, however, regard Voltaire as necessarily right and Leibniz and his followers as necessarily wrong. What is actually meant here by these words? a priori and posteriori reasoning, rationalism and empiricism. Where rationalism and empiricism were very mainstream philosophies or theories during the 18th century. Of course, the 18th century is called sometimes the age of reason because most of the ideas that depended, that this period depended on were things related to the reason. Of course, the most famous philosopher during the 18th century was René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. So what's a rationalist writer or a rationalist philosopher? Well, a rationalist philosopher would be someone like Leibniz, who would actually argue that since God is good, therefore whatever God has created for us is good as well. It's more of an equation. What about the empiricist writers? Well, empiricist writers would be people like Voltaire, who actually have to use their own experience, their sensuous experiences from the world in order to believe in the existence of something. So if they don't see something, this means they don't really believe in it. Another word for rationalism is a priori, and another word for empiricism is posteriori reasoning. So Leibniz was a rationalist philosopher. His approach might be characterized as arguing forward from certain assumptions. Since God is perfect by definition, it follows that he can do no wrong. Voltaire's approach might be described as empirical. He used his experience of the world around him to draw certain conclusions about it. Those two approaches, as I just explained to you, are sometimes referred to as a priori and a posteriori reasoning. Now, this is the end of this video wherein we described and explained together the context behind Voltaire's Candide. We started by discussing information about the author himself. We talked about the genre of the tale. We even called it a tale, not a novel. We call it a satirical tale. It could be affiliated to travel writing, could be affiliated to dystopian literature. And finally, we managed to explain the religious context behind the tale itself. In the next video, I will be looking at the text. Thank you for listening.